This is the RPG Crawler, and welcome to Shelf of Many Things, which is going to be the first episode of what I hope will be a long-running series in which I'll examine indie and small press tabletop titles. I've gone ahead and split this off from my main review series because I do intend to revamp the main review series into another series in itself, so we can cover major party titles and minor party titles. In this particular series, I'll be covering systems, adventures, supplements, and so forth, just so long as they're from developers on the smaller or independent side of things, although undoubtedly I'll be covering some of the larger, small press companies from time to time. It's actually a wonderful time to be an indie RPG developer just due to the wide array of methods of getting product out. From freely distributable PDFs to distribution systems such as DriveThruRPG to print-on-demand services through Lulu, it's not that hard to get a book out now. In fact, it's easier than possibly it has been for a very long time. Although I will likely cover a lot of old school style fantasy systems, I do intend to cover most any genre and any system that catches my eye. I'll cover products whether they are free or whether they are paid, whether they are hard copy or whether they're PDF only, although I will try to stick with my traditions from Indie Game Friday and focus mostly on products that feel at least that they've got some sort of merit or some sort of redeeming quality. If a product is just nothing but trash, I'm probably not going to waste your time covering it. When that having been said, we're going to kick off this series with a system that's a weird mashup of old school and new wave aesthetics, called Dungeons & Delvers Black Book. I was invited to review this by the developers who provided me with an electronic review copy, but I also ordered a hard copy from DriveThruRPG, and I will be speaking about both. Written by David Guile and Melissa Fisher, Dungeons & Delvers was released by Awful Good Games. It's actually one of a couple variations of this system that looks liable to increase later on. The Black Book version covered here is a D20-based system inspired by the old basic D&D Black Box. However, there is a version that utilizes a sort of dice pool system, and from what I understand, another version may be in the works that will cover higher-end play. Further, this book is available in a number of different PDF types, for print and for screen reading, as well as for softcover and hardcover versions of actual hard copies in both color and black and white. Before I get started with a review of the system itself, I want to say that I'm rather pleased with the hard copy version that I acquired. For the size of the system involved, it's nice and portable. It's not large at all. The cover and the binding seem to be relatively durable, and the paper is of a relatively heavy weight. It does have a parchment background effect in addition to the full-color illustrations inside, and it looks quite nice. The PDF version comes with a version that is with and one that is without the background cover. So if you're looking to buy the PDF and print it up yourself, it may be worthwhile to get the no background cover that's more printer friendly. Overall, I'm quite pleased with the physical build itself. Now let's take a look at the actual contents. Usually I leave the artwork critique to later, but in this particular instance, it's actually pretty intrinsic to drawing my eye to the system in the first place. It was the slick-looking cover art that helped set Dungeons & Delvers apart to cover in one of my RPG News roundups, and the people who developed this system actually requested this review led off of that particular roundup. The art is done by the same people who developed the system, David Guile and Melissa Fisher, and if I'm mispronouncing those names, just let me know in the comments below. It is consistent and thematic throughout the book. It's sort of an almost abstract comic style that really captured the theme of an old school style dungeon crawl without being a direct mimic of the old school line art. A few of the images within contained callbacks to D&D art of old, and some were really too obvious to really just be a mere callback, but they were nonetheless appreciated, at least by me. I have to admit that the art is really nice, and it seems almost, and I hate to say this, but almost like the art has the same sort of flavor of something that you'd see in the computer role-playing game Darkest Dungeon. I did take a look at the publisher's storefront, and I noticed that they had art packs both from this book and from their previous Dungeon World products. It's a little bit of a digression, I admit, but the illustrations added enough value to the product that I thought it bore mentioning. So, I got this book, as I said, it's not very large. There's maybe 140 pages or so, including covers and legal, and it's not full-size, as one may have come to expect from full-scale RPG books. Still, it provides a complete system with character creation and advancement rules, sample monsters, core system rules, and so forth. It states in the foreword that the designers were inspired by the Black Box set of D&D, as I stated before, and it follows that this Black Book edition only covers to about level 5, with an appropriate monster spread and equipment spread to handle those particular levels. I have to be honest, the original D&D systems generally tended to be the most well-balanced from levels 1 to 5, so that's really not a big issue for me. But if you're worried about long-term play with this system, there are some included PDFs that describe advancement to level 10, some alternate classes, alternate abilities for some classes, and as I said before, there seems to be plans to expand the system even further. But I believe that'll be another product, so let's focus really on how these 5 levels of the system hold up. When I got the book, I'll have to admit that reading through the foreword kind of gave me a sense of foreboding. The designers have been working with Dungeon World products for some time, and I'll have to admit that while I can see its merits, I'm not the biggest fan of that particular system. Furthermore, it stated that this Dungeons and Delvers system started as a 4th edition hack, and oh god, while I haven't as of this recording actually done my 4th edition review on the retrospective reviews, regular viewers probably will have picked up my opinion of that system so far. So I actually went into this book just thinking I'd made a terrible, terrible mistake. And then I read further, and I'm very glad that I did. Dungeons and Delvers departs radically from 4th edition, especially in almost every way that I personally had issues with 4th edition. Thematically, the Black Book does its utmost to adopt an old-school feel, from the simplification of combat and character advancement to the streamlining of certain skills. And yet, it abandons certain old-school or general D&D conceits as well, adopting a more mythological base for its PC races and monster descriptions, adopting a 4th edition idea of skills being reusable but without the overhead of keeping track of encounters or daily powers, and also modifying how combat itself is treated. The result is something that really feels like its own thing, and yet seems to be more D&D than 4th edition did, despite departing from it more than 4th edition did. And it feels really strange to say that, but I stand by it. So let's take a look at the system. Core mechanics are what you would expect of a modern D20 system, with a dice roll plus modifiers versus a set difficulty class. But once we take a look at character creation, the first changes are crystal clear. Ability scores are still determined by using an array or rolling dice to generate a number between 3 and 18 for the same classic 6 ability scores. But rather than being the number that you jot down, only the modifier is your ability score. So instead of saying, hey, like a 14 strength, you'll have a +1. Ability scores thus range not from 3 to 18, but from -3 to +3, and they're modified from there. If your race gives you a +1, you just bump the bonus up, say from 2 to 3. Races are somewhat streamlined from 4th edition as well, usually having a series of abilities and modifications to ability scores, as well as skill bonuses and speed and the like, but the races themselves are somewhat different. There's a choice of human, dwarf, elf, and kobold, with kobolds being closer to elemental sprites than the lizard creatures from the current D&D iteration. Some of these races do have additional sub-races that can be chosen from as well. For instance, a particular type of kobold, or having a human with fiendish blood, all count as subtypes. Classes are the basic 4. You've got fighters, clerics, wizards, and rogue, and each one is designed to provide choices at each of the levels between 1 and 5. Each class is given a list of weapons and armor that they can use, how many wound points and vitality points they get at each level, what skills they get proficiency in, as well as a series of class features and talents. Class features are what set a particular class apart from the others, while talents are used to customize said class. For instance, the priestly domains and skills function as talents for a cleric, which can use the cleric's class feature of favor to fuel them. Indeed, the classes genuinely feel different from one another, which is more than I can say for the way some of the core D20 systems handle them. Fighters are still fighters and simply get different styles of attack. Rogues likewise get more skills and special attacks, But clerics function off something called favor, which fuels their talents and is refueled each day. A cleric can also make a sacrifice to gain more favor during a particular day, usually in the form of holy and sacred offerings. Wizards, on the other hand, use mana, and certain talents can either reduce the total mana pool available to provide a constant effect, or cost a certain amount of variable mana. This variability is key, because if there's not enough mana to pay for a particular spell, the cost is then paid for from the wizard's vitality. And after their vitality, it takes away from their wound points. Which means that while casting priest spells is something that you can reliably do and expect to have happen the same way every time, casting wizard spells may begin to damage the wizard and is somewhat risky. Indeed, some wizards may opt to cast directly from their health even though they know that it's going to damage them if it looks like a particular spell is needed at that moment. So what's all this talk about wound points and vitality points, you may ask? Well, the combat system is pretty much overhauled from 4th edition. Armor is handled not just as armor class that must be met in order to score a hit, but also features damage reduction. The damage roll has an armor's damage reduction removed from it, and it is then applied to the character's vitality points. Once their vitality points are exhausted, the character then begins to take actual wounds. It basically replaces the whole hit dice and hit point system present in modern iterations of D&D, with vitality points representing swiftly regenerating pools that come back during a short rest, while wound points recover slowly and represent long-term injuries only recovering during long rests. I really actually like how this operates, because some effects are actually given so they only take place if actual wound points are damaged by an attack, and some weapons can pierce armor, while some spells may bypass armor or vitality points entirely. It does make combat potentially more deadly, while reducing the need for a full-time healer. Clerics are still useful, but they don't have to be the party band-aid. If a party is wise and takes their short rests seriously, they may not need much of a healer at all. Interestingly enough, the death saves from 4th and 5th edition are thrown out for a Pathfinder-style stabilization check, albeit with a very high DC. And just because a character recovers from being down and near death, it doesn't mean that they're out of the clear. You can receive various penalties that are either temporary or permanent in nature if the character was too long at death's door. This gives some potentially very serious penalties for dropping during combat, aside from the usual just get healed up and immediately get back into the game. A combat round otherwise follows a simplified 4th edition standard, with your standard action, your character's movement, although there are not really any move equivalent actions, and then a free or swift action. If you're familiar with modern D20 systems, the order of combat really shouldn't take too long to adapt to. Dungeons & Delvers does, however, revert back to the 3rd edition style of reflex, will, and fort saves rather than defensive target numbers from 4th edition. Aside from that, skills are very simplified and very similar to 4th edition, sharing much of the same list in fact. Likewise, equipment is pretty basic, although the economy has been adjusted downward in order to make for a consistently lower value across the board for everything. So it's unlikely that characters are going to end up carting around literal tons of gold, at least not at these low levels. Some weapons do have special effects, like armor piercing, as I said before, that can very much alter their value on the battlefield compared to others, and there's a range of alchemical items that can increase survivability in a dungeon beyond the basic magical classes. Interestingly enough, there's an entire crafting subsystem that functions independent of character skills, and seems to be a decent money sink to consume resources to allow characters to craft gear which may actually be better than what they find in a dungeon or in a store. There's the usual hints and tips for running the game, and then there's the list of monsters, which uses a weird hybrid of 4th edition blocks. Each monster is listed with relevant abilities and actions, but also includes suggested treasure, including potential creature parts for use with the crafting system. Many also include suggestions for adapting the creature for higher or sometimes lower levels. There's not a lot of creatures listed, but they cover a decent range, and with the suggested adaptations they can actually go quite some ways. Further, as I mentioned before, the monsters have a more mythic quality to them, following real-world mythologies and legends, and so may be of a different style than players may be used to. This is incredibly useful for a long-time D&D player just because they'll expect a certain action only to find one that's more in line with actual classical mythology or the like. The book does close out with some very useful guidelines on converting monsters from other systems, a section on traps that can be encountered, and then a list of sample magic items that include actual unique items and not just a rehash of the same classics. While there aren't a huge amount of them, these samples that are given do give enough information to create your own while running the game. And best of all, they avoid the whole 4th edition Magic Shop fixed prices deal. So what does that leave us with? Well, it's a bit strange, as I said, but for what it is, I kind of like it. I honestly think that despite all of the changes, some of them fundamental to how the D&D derived system generally works, Dungeons & Delvers Black Book actually feels, as I said, more like classic D&D than 4th edition did. Where this system, as it stands, will truly shine is when you're talking about short-term dungeon crawl type adventures. There are way better systems out there for epic play and epic sweeping campaigns, but for a quick and dirty dungeon crawl that is in a relatively low fantasy world with a focus on smaller scale exploration and quick play, this gets the job done nicely and in a way that the systems that it is derived from just can't. Quick combat and streamlined systems means that a Black Book game is going to run very swiftly. And there is the potential for growth there, with expanded classes and levels, as well as whatever may develop from future versions. I like it. I didn't expect to like it, but I do. Am I going to play it a bunch? I may run it every so often. I can't say that it's really bumped off anything on my current list of go-to systems, but if you don't have a go-to game to grab for those short-term dungeon crawls, it's definitely worth taking a look. The fact that it's relatively small and portable does mean that I can take it places, so if you're looking for something to run a few dungeons with a couple people that you meet at like a con or someplace similar, it may be worth looking into. Furthermore, the fact that it's technically 4th edition based means that it can be used as a sort of backdoor to get a group that's not interested in older styles of play just to try it out. It's a very solid little system with some gorgeous art design, and I very much want to see where they go from here. And I will leave it at that. I will put a link in the description below. This has been the RPG Crawler with Shelf of Many Things. Leave a like if you enjoyed it, and let me know in the comments below if you want to see more or less of these indie reviews in this particular series, and anything that you'd like to see regarding the format, any suggestions you'd like to make, and so on. Subscribe for more RPG content, both tabletop and computer, and if you are feeling generous, I do have a Patreon page to support this channel at patreon.com/rpgcrawler. Until next time, take care and goodbye.